Hello, it's Govinda Singh, 1984, Governor of 84 Ari of OSNST Limited, and I just wanted to do a blog regarding Iran. I've been reading about Iran this morning just to refresh my memory. I'm the type of person to have an understanding of the present we are living in. We must have an understanding of the past, and we have a grasp and a vague understanding of the past. It gives us an understanding to why things the way they are in the current present that we are living in. So I'm going to start with Iran. Now, in the 18th century, for hundreds of years, a Qajar Islamic dynasty had ruled Persia for hundreds of years as an absolute monarch, and they were very oppressive of the ancient pre-Islamic religions, the ancient pre-Islamic traditions, what Persia used to practice before the arrival of Islam during the Islamic conquests, where Islam was forced on the ancient Aryan Persians. So by the 18th century, the Qajar had ruled for hundreds of years. But in 1905, there was a constitutional revolution in Iran, where a tribal group called the Bakhtiari removed the Qajar dynasty and implemented a constitutional revolution where a parliament was established in Iran. The Qajar Shah was removed from Iran, and he went to Russia. But he tried returning in 1911 to regain power in Iran, but he was resisted. Then from 1911 up until 1921, there's a power struggle in Iran. You had the Bakhtiari, who were growing relatively quite strong, who were gaining power and could possibly rule over Iran, which was worrying other Iranians. But then you had Iranian Persians, you had the Armenians and the Azerbaijani and the Kurds, who were getting backing from the Soviet Union to try and seize control of Iran. But then you had Reza Shah, who later became to be known as Reza Shah, who was being backed by the British. Now, this is where a power struggle was taking control in the 1920s in the region of Iran. So you had the British on one side backing Reza Shah, and you had the Kurds and the Gilans and the Azerbaijanis and the Armenians who were being backed by the Bolshevik Soviet Union. And they were basically fighting over who controls what is going to be a very powerful region in the world due to the oil. And so the British were successful in backing Reza Shah. And in 1921, whereas the Bakhtiari were very prominent and very vital in establishing a constitutional parliament, in a democratic parliament in Iran, after 100 years of absolute monarch rule during the Qajar dynasty, in 1920s, with the British backing Reza Khan, who then became known as Reza Shah. They backed Reza Shah, who then made it his mission to destroy and undermine the autonomy of the Bakhtiari people, because they were oil-rich tribe that had oil within their territories. So Reza Shah decided to make it his mission to destroy the Bakhtiari in the 1920s, and this was when he was getting backing by the British government, who were successful in repelling Soviet influence or regaining influence in Iran. So that happened in 1920. And there were two distinct periods in Reza Shah's rule. When he was crowned the Shah of Iran, there were opponents who initially, they say, Reza Shah wanted to establish a republic, but with opposition to this, especially with the British, they established Reza Shah as the king of Iran. And this is where he took the surname Pahlavi and became to be known as Reza Shah Pahlavi. So this happened in around 1926 or 1926. So there were two distinct periods during Reza Shah Pahlavi's reign. The first, it was about modernization, Western education systems, and things like that. But then there was two distinct periods where the first half, you could say, seemed reasonable, but towards the end of his reign, he became like a despot dictator who started becoming very ruthless and very dictatorial. And many opposition to him were executed. The Bakhtiari notable tribal leaders were executed, imprisoned, to undermine their autonomy and seize control of their resources. But by the time of 1940, and World War II broke out, Reza Shah Pahlavi, he sided with Germany in World War I, and because of this, he was exiled by the British. Now you have to understand, during the 1920s, when the Cossack brigade, the Persian Cossacks, were repelling the Soviet-backed Iranians returning to Iran, Reza Shah had the backing of the British government, the Tory British government. And by 1940s, because Reza Shah would not withdraw support for Germany in World War II, the British government had him exiled, I think it was to Egypt. And this is when his son Reza Pahlavi, he has a son, Reza Shah had a son called Reza Pahlavi, who was the crown prince, who then became Shah of Iran. And Reza Shah, his father, was exiled to Egypt for siding with Nazi Germany. But during this period from 1920s up until the 1940s, the Bakhtiari Iranian tribes was severely persecuted. And this was the same Bakhtiari tribe that made a constitutional revolution possible in 1905. And they were undermined, and their autonomy was not recognized because they had oil beneath their territory. So they were seen as a tribe to pick on and push around to steal their oil. So this happened. So from 1940, after Reza Shah was exiled and his son Reza Pahlavi becomes the Shah of Iran, there was a prime minister called Mossadegh. Now Mossadegh is of Bakhtiari origins. He's from the Bakhtiari Luri region of Iran, and he's from the Bakhtiari tribe that were being persecuted by Reza Shah from the 1920s. And he was democratically elected as the Prime Minister of Iran. But by the 1950s, the Anglo company, the British Anglo Oil Exploration Company, had a 50-50% deal with the Saudi Arabians in regards to searching and exploring for oil. And if they find oil, they will split the revenue, the profit they make from trading the oil 50-50. So the Anglo-British company will keep 50% and the Saudis will keep 50%. But when the Anglo Oil Company wanted to do business with Iran, they wanted to split it 70-30, meaning the British Anglo Oil Company keeps 70% and Iran gets 30%. Now this is a piss take. This is taking Iranians for idiots. So Prime Minister Mossadegh of the Bakhtiari, he nationalized the Iranian resources, so outsiders cannot take Persians for idiots. But Reza Shah Pahlavi, who was now the crown prince, the Shah of Iran, he intervened, and with the backing of Winston Churchill and the Tory government from Britain, he organized a coup in 1953 where they overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mossadegh, for a very violent coup. It is said that Mossadegh's, the Prime Minister of Iran, Mossadegh's daughter developed severe mental health problems because of the trauma of the coup in 1953. And this is where Reza Pahlavi, should I say, becomes the absolute monarch of Iran from 1953 all the way up until 1979, which is about 30 years of absolute monarch. During this time, no opposition activity was allowed. All opposition was oppressed. You had the guerrilla movements of the Fadayan, the People's Fadayan, who started off as communism back then in the 1950s and the 1960s, but in 2020 they're leaning more towards democratic socialism. But there was a lot of opposition parties that were imprisoned, political prisoners. They weren't allowed to have media, or they weren't allowed to have any opposition activity from 1953 up until 1979. In regards to the mullahs, they were oppressed also, but that's a different discussion. But there was also people who were very much into modernization, education system that's modeled on the Western system, the Western modernization, but they simply opposed the autocratic and the dictatorship of Reza Pahlavi's absolute monarch of his reign. So by 1979, there was a prime minister called Shahpur Bakhtiari. Now, what's so important about the prime minister up in 1979 Iran, called Shahpur Bakhtiari? His father, Sardari Fateh, in the 1920s was executed by Reza Shah because he was a notable Bakhtiari leader. So the son of the minister who was killed by Reza Shah in the 1920s, he's become prime minister in 1979, and he's working for he's working for Reza Pahlavi, who was the son of Reza Shah. This is getting a bit muddled up. I'm making a bit getting a bit muddled, but let me just restart that. I'll start again. In 1979, Shah Pahlavi is the Prime Minister of Iran. His father was executed in the 1920s by Reza Shah, but he decided to work for Reza Pahlavi and be the Prime Minister under Reza Pahlavi's reign, because he decided if he opposes Reza Pahlavi, the mullahs are going to seize control of power in Iran. So it's better to work as a Prime Minister under Reza Pahlavi to prevent the mullahs from seizing power. Even though Reza Pahlavi's father, Reza Shah, executed Shah Pahlavi's father in the 1920s, he decided to still work with them to stop the mullahs from seizing power. There, that makes sense now. So by the time of 1979, Matin Daftari, who was the grandson or the son of Prime Minister Mossadegh, addressed a rally of 1 million people, saying that the Shah, Reza Pahlavi, has gone too far. People have been living under fear. Many political prisoners have gone missing, tortured, murdered by Reza Pahlavi's absolute monarch. So pressure is building up in 1979. Khomeini, when Reza Shah leaves Iran in 1979, because there's an uprising by the Republicans, establishing a Republic of Iran is not the problem. People want a secular, democratic Republic of Iran. But Khomeini returned from France.